Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, a podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Meslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on Carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Dr. Angela Stanton is a migraine expert with a doctorate in neuroeconomics, which combines economics and neuroscience. Angela's specialty was the neurotransmitters that are associated with decision-making. She now studies how the brain and nutrition interrelate, specifically focusing on migraines as a channel pathology, where electrolyte imbalance induced by glucose sensitivity and carb intolerance is causing havoc. Her latest book, Fighting the Migraine Epidemic, a complete guide, how to treat and prevent migraines without medicines. And she is the founder of the Stanton Migraine Protocol. Her focus is on the importance of electrolytes and nutrition for migraine-free and medicine-free life. Welcome to the show, Angela. Really happy to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me. Looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah. So I'd love to just start with a little bit more on your background and interest in migraines and how you developed this interest and expertise in it.
Okay. So it's not really an interest per se. It was a requirement because I've been a migrainer since childhood. I didn't know that at the time. But as I grew older, the worse they get. And that seems to be typical for other people as well. I'm not unique in that, particularly for women. And so I reached a point where I said, okay, that's it. Quit everything. This has to be solved because there's just no solution. They put you on a lot of medications. They do a lot of tests, but of course, there are no tests directly for migraine. There are no real true medications that can prevent migraine. And there's not even an understanding of what migraine is. And so I decided to research what migraine was, first of all, and then to discover if there was anything I could do to improve my personal situation. So it was a selfish motive when I initially started. And then it sort of kind of blossomed into, well, wow, whatever I'm doing is working for me. So why not see if this may work for others? And it sort of kind of turned into what it is today, which is a very big protocol with tens of thousands of people using it all over the world and working for everyone. So it has become now my official job, so to speak.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And how many people suffer from migraines? And maybe just simply, what is a migraine for anyone listening who doesn't know, and how is it different from a headache?
Okay, very good questions. So it's three different questions. So the first one is that it seems that the migraine percentage in the population is pretty stable, 12 to 15%, depending upon what literature you look at. And this seems to be quite generally all over the world, everywhere. And it's not growing and it's not decreasing. So it's a genetic variant. It is a genetic condition. It is not something that you can just get out of the blue. I mean, you can. I suppose the very first person who had the migraine just had a genetic variant and it turned out to be a migraine. So you can. But generally speaking, it's inherited through your parents or your grandparents. It can skip generations. Like in my case, my mother never had a migraine in her life, nor did my father. But my grandmother did. And so it is a definite genetic variant of the brain. And so the migraine brain, it's not really a disease. It is a different brain. So if you look at the brain, for example, of a person with blue eyes, it's a variant versus a person with brown eyes. There are disadvantages associated with having a blue eye or having a brown eye, just like there are advantages. So it's pretty much geographically selective, if I may say it so. So migraine also has advantages because migraine isn't a disease. It's a different brain that had provided some advantages. And we can talk about what those advantages are, but there are a lot of advantages to being a migrainer. But it just doesn't help us today in our modern society with the foods we eat and with all the stimulation that is around us. So today it hurts. And so here's also then your third question, which was, what is the difference between a migraine as opposed to just a headache? So first of all, a large percent of migraine sufferers don't ever have a headache associated with migraine. So you can have migraines without a headache. So it's not a requirement. And not only not a requirement, but then clearly you can't define migraine by a headache. And so what we can say is that typically a headache associated with a migraine, if a headache is associated with a migraine, is a certain type of a headache, which is different from other kind of headaches. And so whereas a standard headache that people may get could be a sinus headache, which would be from an infection, or it could be a stress headache, or there are other serious headaches like cluster headache, thunderclap headaches, etc. They're all different. So there are distinguishing factors based on which you can identify what you have. A migraine headache is always on one side of the head. It may change sides during the migraine or between migraines, but it's always on one side at a time. And there are anatomical reasons for this. And so when people say, well, I have this horrific pain that's both sides of my head, it must be a migraine. Not really. First of all, migraine need not be that big of a pain. There are much bigger pains. Cluster headache is significantly more painful than a migraine. So it isn't really just a big headache. It is a very specific headache, and headache is just one of many of the symptoms. A typical migraine comes with also vomiting. When was the last time a standard headache caused vomiting to a person? It also comes with dizziness. Some people fall over literally from vertigo. It can come, for example, hemiplegic migraines means half your body temporarily may get paralyzed. You may have seen people slurring, or there was a TV anchor who was in the middle of reporting something and she didn't even notice that she garbled the words. It was backwards and there was absolutely no meaning to what she said, but she couldn't even recognize that she said something that had no meaning. People thought she had a stroke. Turned out she had a migraine.
Wow.
It didn't even come with pain. And so migraine is not at all associated with a headache. It may be one of its symptoms.
Got it. That's really helpful. So we've covered the what and the who. Now I'd love to dig into the why. So what causes and contributes to migraines? Like genetics, diet, lifestyle? Is it all of those? And how do migraines come about?
Okay, so it's all of those. And there's a very specific way based on which migraine can come about. So it is genetic, as discussed, but there are many other genetic conditions that will require you to eat in a different way. For example, one of them could be that you can't, for whatever reason, you have a glycogen storage genetic condition, so you can't retain glycogen. So then you have to keep on feeding glucose for you so that your red blood cells have enough glucose available to them, even if you're eating just a sad diet, because you can't store any glycogen. And so there are some genetic conditions that will mandate you to eat differently and eat different foods, regardless of your health. That's just to survive. So having to have a different requirement for nutrition for migraine is nothing special if you consider it that way. It's just a genetic condition that would require you to eat differently. And so the direct cause of migraine, outside of being genetic, so let's forget that for a second. But what it actually means is that this variant changed the brain. And so the differences in a migraine brain versus somebody else's brain is that in the migraine brain, the sensory organs, like your nose, your eyes, your ears, the taste buds, the skin, these have more sensory connections. So what that means is that if you have, say, nervous system, your nose, your olfactory bulb is connected to so many, say, one neuron in your brain, and then that has connections to other neurons, and say 10. Then in a migraine brain, the number of connections of this one neuron that comes from your nose, the olfactory bulb, will be a lot more. And so what we're talking about is that if an odor is coming into the nose of a person who is not a migraineur, the passing of the message to other neurons is going to be less amplified because there are only so many neurons it's connecting to. In a migraine brain, it connects to a lot more neurons. And so the message will be a lot greater. And so as a result of that, and also because there are more connections, there's going to be more electrolytes used. There will be more action potential in the brain. Everything is going to be more. We need more energy. in the brain of a migrainer. So when you're talking about a brain that requires more energy, and it isn't necessarily glucose, because glucose is one tool to that energy, but there's a function that in the brain is created, which is the voltage. It's an electricity that basically the brain is working on. So when we're talking about energy, we have to kind of define what energy we lack in the brain. And salt and potassium, magnesium, water, these are all electrolyte elements within which our brain can function and create electricity and thereby send messages from one neuron to the next by creating neurotransmitters, which was my research originally. And so in a migraine brain, if I'm looking at comparing the brains, and the migraine brain has more connections, it is more excitable, it therefore uses more electrolyte, may be that the genetic problem, which is the basic mutation of the channels by which the electricity is created, is the problem. And if you look at the genetic variants in the migraine brain, and you can do that at the Human Genome Project, which is found at the genecards.org. And you can see that the first 10 variants in the migraine brain, which are the most pronounced and the most important in terms of migraine, are all ionic channel variants. And so we can't regenerate our voltage the same way as a person who doesn't have migraine does, yet we need more voltage. So we have a problem in how our genes work. This is called channelopathy. And so a migraine is basically based on channelopathy. So that is the definition of the actual cause of migraine. But how you cause the discomfort and the migraine pain and the migraine symptoms is by these channels that have the genetic mutation toward channelopathy are unable to transfer the nutrients properly, or transfer too little, or simply can't replicate the process fast enough. Whatever the variant is, we have to look to see the source of the nutrients that they require to work properly. And so over the years, in my experiment, long before I discovered what really truly the immediate cause of migraine was, I discovered that the problem is that these channels that are broken in more ways than one, for whatever reason, don't have enough access to salt, sodium particularly. And sodium is essential to initiate voltage. That's the action potential. And potassium would be the resting potential. That's when sodium leaves the cell and potassium comes in. And magnesium is very important to literally open the pump, the gates. It's connecting to an ATP to open it. So we have many different elements here. So we have ATP, we have magnesium, potassium and sodium, and also calcium is the one that literally kicks out the message from the other end of the neuron, which makes it communicate to the other neurons. So we use more of all of these as a result of the more active brain. And so if you don't have more of all of these in our brain, then maybe we simply run short of something, and then we can't communicate, and this causes a problem. So this is when I started experimenting, and I started taking salt. Everybody starts taking magnesium first because that is the most known. And I will just add magnesium. And then people tell you, well, just take potassium. So my doctor prescribed for me prescription dose potassium. I got sicker than a dog from that one, because it turns out I have more than enough potassium, but I didn't have enough sodium. So actually that made me even more migraine prone. Magnesium is an excitatory mineral for the migraine brain. So taking magnesium on its own also made things worse. The only thing that actually helped was salt. And so I started taking salt every single day, first just in the morning, then several times throughout the day. And of course, now it has become the treatment, the natural treatment. And then I also had to understand one of the variants that was in this list that was not clear to me was a solute carrier. I said, okay, what does a solute carrier have to do with the channelopathy? And then I discovered that this solute carrier is actually sodium transporter glucose transporter. So a very large percent of our glucose from our blood gets transported out, not by insulin. We only talk about insulin all the time, but actually insulin is only used for the muscles. It isn't used for the brain. It's not necessary.
Interesting.
It moves by diffusion. It's a passive diffusion. It goes by osmolality. So if you look to see the concentration and it's going to move that way, there will be some delay, but there's going to be a concentration. So if you have a sodium transporter channel not working that carries glucose, then you have a problem also with the glucose and the sodium transporter. And so then it makes a lot of sense to look to see what happens to the brain if you eat glucose. And so we have a carbs-heavy diet. And looking at, in this process, also bumped into a medical manual in which it described that if you eat glucose or carbohydrates, when glucose enters the cells, it literally kicks sodium and water out. So if a migraineur has a problem with glucose, has a problem with salt, has a problem with electricity in general, and these channels are broken, then if the migraineur eats carbohydrates, which converts to glucose, and that removes sodium and water from the brain or from the cells everywhere, then that's a problem. So this was a discovery that, okay, so what happens then if we eat a diet without carbohydrates, or at least reduce it? And that solved a lot of problems, provided we added extra salt.
A lot of people ask me about how to make liver more tasteful and how to cook it or incorporate other organ meats on Carnivore. Optimal Carnivore can help you do just that with their grass-fed organ complex. It was created by carnivores for carnivores. They start by sourcing 100% grass-fed organ meats from New Zealand, gently freeze-drying the organs and encapsulating them into convenient bovine gelatin capsules. Just 6 of these capsules a day is the same as eating an ounce of raw organ meat. I personally take these every single day, as does my wife. Even though we both eat liver and other organ meats, our ancestors would have eaten the whole animal. And this unique blend has 9 different organs, including beef liver, brain, thymus, kidney, spleen, etc. And I think it's great to get a daily dose of these organs when you can. So it covers all your bases, whether you're at home or traveling. What's also cool is they plant a tree for every product sold, which helps the environment. So visit www.optimalcarnivore.com/carnivorecast and use the code carnivore10 to receive 10% off your purchase. Thanks, and back to the show. That's super interesting. And thank you for explaining the mechanisms behind all of that. My next question was going to be about electrolytes and nutrition specifically. But because you just hit on that, how low do you find migraineurs need to go in their carbohydrates to find relief? And also, do they need to be monitoring their protein amount as well at all? And how do you think about those levers before? And then we can go into electrolytes after.
Okay, excellent questions. So it depends on pretty much on the person of how sensitive they are, because there are different type of migraines, different lengths the person that had the migraine for. And also, of course, migraineurs are genetically, therefore, as we have just described, are predisposed to not being able to handle glucose properly. And so there's a genetic predisposition to not being able to eat that much carbohydrate. So it's difficult to decide or to discover without experimenting how much a migraineur has to cut the carbohydrates down. What I am now doing, and what seems to work really good, is everybody who joins me in my efforts starts out with just a low carb, high fat. Many people still take medications as well. And the medications oftentimes conflict or interact with ketosis. So I try to keep them at a level of ketosis that is still, it's just very low. It's just at a very low nutritional ketosis level. It doesn't go into any higher, because I am considering, I'm a little bit concerned that there might be some interaction. I had a very big interaction when I started because of my heart, because so many migraineurs have put on medications that damage the heart. And then you have to take medication for the heart, and there's a huge interaction there. And so the level that a migraineur should go to reducing carbohydrates when they start, I would say, is just a low carb, high fat, which would be between 50 and 70 carb grams net carbs for women, and I believe it's 65 to 85 for men, something like that. And then and there are other factors there, because of course we have to increase salt and how much salt we increase, and we also have to increase water because we need extra water, and our food has to be extremely potassium rich so that we have also the potassium, the sodium, and the water. And then we can supplement also magnesium. Calcium apparently we have more of in a migraineur than for other people, so we don't need to supplement calcium. But the other elements we need to supplement or get plenty of. So it's not just salt, but it's other things as well. It's not just carbs, but it's a combination of factors. And so a person who just started getting migraines, say a year ago, and has only taken triptans and nothing else in his or her life will have a lot less trouble than a person who's had migraines for 50 years and has been on all kinds of preventives. Some people come in with a list of 40 medicines that they're taking. It's absolutely amazing what they have to do, and they still have migraines. And so it's very much dependent. So what I did do is after they started the low carb, high fat diet, which is 60% fat and then 20 protein and carbs, or 25 protein and 15 carbs, depends on, we'll talk about protein in a minute. If then they also increase the salt, they increase the water, everything is pretty much controlled. And then it seems that they become migraine-free already. And so they can start reducing their medications. And so once they have come off of the medications, then they can switch to the ketogenic diet. Then there's no more limitation. Now, in between, I often use the carnivore diet. And I do that for people who, I have a 5-hour test. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Kraft. Joseph Kraft had a Kraft diabetes in situ, which was a 5-hour postprandial test for blood glucose. And he used insulin, which of course I can't test. So we use ketones as a proxy. And so every single person who comes through my door to the migraine group on Facebook and all my private clients have to do this 5-hour test where they eat a protocol diet, which would be a low carb, high fat diet, or whatever they eat if they want to do it right away as they come in. And it's a 5-hour postprandial test every 30 minutes. And so when I see the blood glucose and blood ketone interaction, I can see their metabolic status extremely well. And if I see sugar crash, or if I see reactive hypoglycemia, which would be going near the sugar crash or lower postprandially than what the blood glucose was before, then I move them to the carnivore diet. And my carnivore diet in the protocol group is a very high protein diet. And one of the reasons is because protein, as you know, the amino acids that it's made of, 20 amino acids. Of the 20, only 7 are ketogenic. I'm sorry, only 2 are ketogenic that are only ketogenic. And then there are 5 others that can go toward ketosis or to glucogenesis. And so if you eat more protein than your body could possibly use for protein synthesis, that excess will turn to glucose in your body. It's going to become glycogen. So the people who have experienced a lot of sugar crashes, instead of eating sugar, eating protein is equivalently sufficient to keep them from sugar crash and reactive hypoglycemia. So I use, and it seems that I would say about a good 90% of the migraineurs starting the low carb, high fat end up on a carnivore diet as a result. Very few of them who don't end up with sugar crashes when they switch to a low carb diet.
Got it. That's really helpful and super interesting that you sometimes use the carnivore diet as a transitional piece. Do you have people who stay on the carnivore diet when they try that? They just enjoy it so much or finding such great results? Yeah,
well, there are 2 kind of people that I find who stay on it. One, because they have such a great result that they don't ever want to change because they don't have any more migraines. And then there's another group that says, well, it's just very easy. I don't have to measure anything because, like I said earlier, is I put them on a high protein diet. So the protein percentage at the time when I put them on is pretty high. It's by weight. It's not by calories. It's 60 to 70% protein. That's pretty hard to reach because most of the beef cuts that you can buy in the stores are like, say, 80% lean. 80% lean is actually pretty fat. It has a lot more fat in it. And this is by calories, but by weight, it's significantly more. So if you're looking at it, for example, taking a ribeye, it's pretty much 50-50 if you're looking at it in terms of calories. And so we need to restrict that to be less on the fat side because fat, of course, if there's no carbohydrate in the diet, is going to increase ketosis. And we don't want to do that. That's the whole point. We want to reduce the level of ketosis in spite of the fact that there's no carbohydrate in the diet. So we have to keep the protein higher level to ensure gluconeogenesis is going to happen with the excess protein. So they will get more glucose than they would otherwise, even though they're not eating carbohydrates. And so this kind of sort of tends to reduce the amount of or the frequency of of issues of even if it's not a sugar crash per se, like if somebody's coming in with a very high level of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, with the average blood glucose, I'm just going to say a number, 300 milligram per deciliter, which is huge. That person may experience a sugar crash at 200 milligrams per deciliter because their body just doesn't get in, the cells don't get enough glucose because the insulin is so insensitive that it's not able to deliver the glucose to the muscles. And so the sugar crash itself is a relative statement, if I may say so. It's not an exact number. Of course, the exact number also exists, medically speaking, if you go down to below 70, technically you're in a sugar crash zone, but it can happen at a much higher level. And for people who are in ketosis all the time, a sugar crash may not happen until they're below 60. So there's just a huge range. And so I find protein is a very good stepping stone.
So it's interesting. The brain can't make up for the lack of glucose through ketones alone. You actually need to find a way to get more glucose to the brain through glucose. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that
through gluconeogenesis.
They may have plenty of glucose, but the insulin is stuck. So if there's an insulin requirement, and even though the brain doesn't really need insulin, certain parts do, but not all need insulin. Still, there could be plenty of insulin there. It crosses the blood-brain barrier, so there could be plenty of insulin in the brain. And then once it's in there, what is it going to do? It will be looking for something to do. And what does insulin do? It does many things. It's a growth hormone. It deposits fat. None of these can you do in the brain. So the only thing you can do as an insulin in the brain is to take glucose out of the blood and give it to the cells that may or may not need it. And if the cells don't need it, it still has to somehow get somewhere. And if there are no ketones in exchange either. And so the problem is if you have high insulin, say you're a diabetic and you're just not experiencing what you feel as a sugar crash. And so you went from 200 milligram per deciliter to say 150. And so you feel a terrible sugar crash afterwards, a 50-point drop. But you still have high glucose and you still have high insulin. So you can't actually use ketones, even if there are ketones in your blood. This is the essence, basically, of ketoacidosis. In that case, you don't have insulin, but you have high glucose and you have high ketones in your blood. And so you can't really use either. And it basically acidifies your blood. And so it's not that much different if you have diabetes and you have ketones as well as glucose, as well as insulin in your blood. And you can see that you can have all three. So, and this is when the 5-hour test is so important to see how things move and change. So for example, assume for a second as a standard baseline that you just woke up and you don't have insulin resistance, so your blood glucose is 90 and your ketones is say 1. That's just an average level. But then you eat a breakfast that has carbohydrates in it. So your glucose increases immediately from 90, it goes to 120, which is a huge jump, but it's still within normal by all American standards, right? But because you just ate a lot of glucose, your insulin also releases. So what happens to the ketones? You had 1 millimole per liter of beta hydroxybutyrate in your blood as ketones stored for future use. So what happens to the ketones now that it's in your blood, but so is excess glucose now, and also insulin. So what happens is that ketone use will stop the moment you have eaten some glucose. Your ketone use will stop, but ketone building or generating won't stop yet because your liver is still manufacturing. There's a little signal delay. It's just a couple of seconds, but in that delay period, your liver is still making ketones. And so your ketones in your blood, if you then take your blood glucose and blood insulin, you're going to have and blood ketones, you're going to have both increased. Because as your insulin is increasing in your blood and the glucose are still in there, they haven't been taken out because you're still eating and you're still just adding excess glucose, you already can't use ketones. So the ketones will also increase. So there's going to be a time that you can see everything increase and nothing is moving. And then the insulin is going to start taking glucose out. And so you may end up with a huge drop in your glucose, at the same time, a huge increase in your ketones. And a lot of people, including the GKI index, thinks, this is great. I am not in great ketosis, but actually you're not. this simply shows to you that your insulin is high, so your glucose just went low, and your ketones are not used, they're just backing up. And so it is very complicated to understand. And this 5-hour postprandial test, the Kraft in situ, that I sort of kind of use as a baseline for my tool, is an excellent test for me to see whether you are in ketosis in the proper way, or are you just making ketones, but you're not actually ever using them, because that also happens. And how is the response of your insulin and glucose, and what's happening to ketones? So these three tell me whether you have insulin resistance or not, and to what degree.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. I think so many people just chase a high ketone number, a low blood sugar number, and they think this metric good, this metric bad. I want to get this one higher and this one lower. But there's a lot of nuance to it. And I think that's why it's so important to have someone like you interpreting those numbers and having the broader context of what's going on with them. And talking a little bit about electrolytes and electrolyte imbalances, I want to go through each of them, but let's start with salt. How much salt is appropriate for people, or do you kind of titrate it up and see when the migraines start to disappear? And then when is it outside of meal times or only with meals? Because some people are, I find it, at least in this community of carnivore and low carb and keto, they're eating 2 meals a day. They have these pretty long fasted periods throughout the day, maybe 14, 16, 18 hours when they're not eating at all. So do you have them also take in sodium during those times? And then is there such thing as too much sodium?
Right. Excellent questions. And so, yes, in fact, there are all kinds of tricks here. So there's no such as an upper limit for how much salt a person needs. But it very much depends on several factors. So one factor is how much water the person drinks. So let me back up a little bit here, because there's an important element here that is seldom actually mentioned, even in literature, where they're discussing like salt increases blood pressure, et cetera, which is true. They're forgetting about one very important element. And that important element is the kidneys. So the kidneys have an overseeing system that is called the RAAS, which is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And its sole job is that if the kidneys, which, by the way, our blood circulates through the kidneys 5 times per hour, if the blood finds that any of the electrolytes, and by this, I'm talking about just sodium and potassium, is out of balance from what it should be, then the RAAS kicks in and instructs the kidney to either spare, meaning save one of the electrolytes, the one that there's less of, or dump or waste the one that is into high level. So if you're taking salt with a very salty meal, for example, whether you're migraine or not, doesn't matter. If you're taking an extremely salty meal and you're not drinking water or potassium and not eating potassium with that meal, then you're going to have too much salt in your blood relative to the amount of water and the amount of potassium. So your kidneys immediately will dump that excess salt. So that excess salt you will only have in your body for about 12 minutes. Because if the blood is run through the kidney 5 times an hour and we have about 5 liters of blood, that means every 12 minutes, your blood is going to be cleared from the excess. This is very important because you can't really overdo salt as a result. The only time you can overdo salt is if 2 conditions are met. One is that you have type 2 diabetes, in which case insulin holds onto salt or sodium. And the other case is when you have a heart disease, which is connected to type 2 diabetes. You have a heart disease and you have very inflexible cardiovascular walls because it's filled with inflammation. And therefore, if you take in salt more than what you normally should, and your blood volume increases as a result, provided you also take in water, it can't stretch. And so if it can't stretch, then it's going to increase your blood pressure. So people who have a hypertension or increased blood pressure, suffering from this inflexibility of their cardiovascular system. And so it isn't directly related to salt. Salt is just the reason that you discover that there is a cardiovascular system problem there. And so the vessels can't flexible themselves enough to become a little bit bigger or constrict to become tighter. And so if you have that problem, then you do have a limit on salt. because that then will say that, okay, if I take excess salt and I will drink more water because salt will make you thirsty as well, then I'm going to have a problem of increased blood volume. And even if it's just lasting for 12 minutes, because my kidneys are going to wash it out, provided I have a healthy pair of kidneys, that's another requirement there, then even the 12 minutes may be too much for a high blood pressure, because that's a stroke danger as well. And so for healthy people, there is no upper limit of salt, because the healthy kidneys will wash out anything excess. So with this said and done, how much excess salt you take at once matters. So if I take, I'm just going to give you an example, a quarter cup of salt a day throughout the day, and I'm eating plenty of potassium and I'm drinking a lot of water, and a quarter cup of salt is a lot. It's much, much more than anybody should take, but just giving it as an example, if I'm taking a quarter cup of salt, if I'm eating also a lot of potassium from foods, and I also drink plenty of water, then nothing's going to happen. I'm just going to urinate it out. It's just going to wash through my kidneys. But if I just take that much salt and I'm also not taking extra water and extra potassium with it, then I'm going to have a problem, even if I'm healthy. And so we need to know how frequently you should be taking the salt. Is more important than how much you take at once. But there's a limit on how much you can take at once, such that you won't get hurt, because your your kidneys have a limitation to how much they can excrete. So this is individual. So there's no definite guideline that will work for me the same way as it will work for you. And for a migraineur, it will be very different also, because if you consider that a migraine brain uses more salt to start with, then obviously what is normal for me is going to be different from somebody who's not a migraineur. So I can take more salt, and it's not going to count as excess salt. It isn't excess salt. It is the salt amount I need, which is different from what you need. So we have many factors here of how to decide whether somebody is taking too much salt or not enough salt. And it's very individual. And the amount of water also varies, because men, for example, need a lot more water than women do. Their bodies is 70% water, whereas for women it's about 55%. And so when we're looking at this comparison, a man can tolerate, as a result, more salt, because in the water as a solute, part of the electrolyte system, that there is going to be more salt possible, provided he also eats some heavier potassium diet. So the balance between the sodium and potassium is more important than the individual amount of each. And then you had a question about the health, and do you want more questions on this?
Yeah. So I find it really interesting that you talk about like the kidneys being a almost safety mechanism for making sure you don't have too much sodium. My carnivore diet, I was being quite foolish and seeing how much salt I could take in and seeing how it made me feel. And I was just putting more and more salt on my meat and drinking more and more water. And I was urinating all the time. Right. One, because of all the water I was taking in. Two, because of the amount of protein I was eating. Because when I was salting my food so much, I was making it hyper palatable. And these steaks and ground beef just became so tasty because there was so much salt on it. Right. And then I drank a lot of water and excreted salt, and it was a vicious cycle. And then I needed more sodium. I got to a point where I was intaking 40 grams of sodium a day, not salt, sodium, and drinking like 10 plus liters of water and peeing, several times during the night. And I went to these doctors, and they were like, and I was like, is there something wrong with my kidneys? And what we eventually found out is my kidneys were actually super healthy. They were doing their job. They were performing exactly what they needed to do, which was getting rid of the excess nitrogen from the protein and getting rid of the sodium properly. But it was creating this vicious cycle. So I had to dial it back and go closer to like 8 grams of sodium per day and measure it for a little bit. But do you have prescriptions for like how much sodium people should start with, or is it only with meals or outside of meal times as well? Okay.
So it's both. It's not just with meals. It's outside as well. And so we're going to talk about fasting as well. But in terms of the guideline of how much to start with, I'm not a doctor. I'm not making any medical recommendations here. And that's important to say. But there are 3 articles, academic articles that very specifically, one in the Lancet and one in the British Medical Journal, both very specifically state the ideal level of sodium for both a healthy person as well as a person with a heart problem. And what they recommend is that the standard that we currently have at the FDA guidelines is actually unhealthy low-level sodium for survival. The optimal starts at, they recommend 45 or 4,600 milligrams sodium is the ideal recommended for the general population. And they showed I think this was a Lancet study, which showed the curve with the plus and minus, as the mean is in the middle, which is what they recommended. But then, of course, there's a huge variance. And they were looking at the risk ratio for survival. And they discovered that for some people, even up to, I think it was 12 grams of sodium a day, so it's 12,000 milligrams sodium a day, their health was still improving and their risk was still reducing. So again, it's very individual, but the minimum what they recommended was 4,600 milligram. And then there was a 3,500 milligram that I remember that I think was for people with heart disease who had the cardiovascular issue that I mentioned earlier, where their cardiovascular inflammation prevents their veins from expanding or contracting the proper way. So even they recommended a much higher amount than what the FDA currently recommends, or the USDA. And in fact, what they recommend now for people with heart disease, which was 1,800 milligram all the way down to 1,200 milligram, showed an exponential increase of death as a result of just simply having too little salt, because we forget how much salt is used by all organs to function. All cells need salt. And in fact, if we dissolve a person today, if we dissolve you as a person today, and we want to just check what is left once all the water is gone, all the blood is gone, everything's gone, and we just take all the minerals, there's going to be about 1.5 pounds, between 1 pound to 1.5 pounds amount of salt in you. That's just a huge amount of salt. And we need to continuously replenish that. There are some animals that can just eat salt once a year and then retain it and slowly spread it out over the year, but humans are not like that. And so we need to have a lot of salt, because every single cell in our body is basically in this little mini ocean. We forget that we are basically an ocean creature. Our infants in our fetuses in the mother's womb is in the seawater. That's the water that the child is in. So I don't see why we would think that we can just remove salt from our diet when we grow up in adults. And so in terms of how to eat salt, so migraines are different from the general population. In migraine, because we use so much salt while we're sleeping, the migraine brain is just hyperactive during sleep. And most migraineurs have nightmares and very vivid REM periods when they're dreaming. We just use a lot of salt. So most migraineurs wake with a 3:30, 4 a.m. migraine. And to prevent that, we go to bed taking a particular dose of salt, which in our case is 1/8 of a teaspoon or 300 milligrams sodium. Take that with a cup of water, which is 8 ounces of water. It's 240 milliliter, I believe. And so we go to bed with taking that. In some, it's 2 salt doses and 2 glasses of water. Like I take 2 before I go to sleep, because if I don't, then I just don't sleep. I'm just dreaming and I wake up and have issues. And then in the morning when we wake up, the first thing that I do before I do anything else is drink, again, a glass of water and take a dose of salt. And in my case, again, that's 2. So 2 doses of salt and 2 glasses of water. So just a period of sleeping and waking, it is a total of 4 glasses of water and 4 doses of salt pill, each 300. So it's 1,200 milligrams sodium that I just take just for sleeping and waking up. So, and that has nothing to do with food. And then if I fast, and in my case, I fast usually 19 to 20 hours a day. And then I leave 45 hours to eat 2 meals. So I'm not supporter of OMAD, of eating once. So I'm eating twice. And so I divided the number of wake hours that I have by the amount of water I need. So I calculated how many glasses of water I need. I need minimum 9, and maximum, I forget what the maximum was. It's like 14 or 15 glasses of water was my maximum. So I have to be somewhere in between the 9 to 15. And so if I'm aiming for the minimum, 9 glasses of water a day. And that means that for every single glass, for me, it's 300 milligrams sodium minimum. That's in addition to what I put on my food. Some people may need more, some people may need less. So this comes with sort of experimenting and trial and error to see where you stand and how much you need. But in my case, it is 300 milligram. And actually, I have a capsule that I take, which I designed. And that one is 360 milligrams per little capsule. And that's iodized salt. And I take that all throughout the day regularly. So there's no time without salt. Let's put it that way. It's evenly distributed.
Makes sense. And how, thank you for walking through that. And how does how do potassium, magnesium, and calcium play a role along with sodium or not play a role, but how do you recommend people incorporate them? And also, do you include iodine at all, or think it's necessary for people to supplement with iodine?
Right. Let me start with the iodine because that's a really important one right off. And it's sort of separate from all others because it's not an electrolyte and it's extremely important. So the salt, the electrolyte pill that I created is basically salt and iodine. It's iodized salt. And I recommend iodine strongly to be supplemented for all people, except if they have Hashimoto's or Graves' disease. So these are two conditions in which they better talk to the doctors and decide what they do or don't need, because they still need iodine, just in a different form. But iodine is very important. And there are a lot of videos and a lot of books and articles out there of how much iodine. I'm pretty much sticking with the RDA, but there are some people who exceed that particularly women, because iodine is also quite important for women. It's in the mammary glands. It's a lot of receptors for iodine. And so a lot of women in particular who need more iodine than the RDA because they need it more, not just for the thyroid, but they also need it for their other sexual organs and maybe even for the nervous system. I don't know. And in terms of the other elements that you mentioned, so let me go one by one because they each are quite different. So calcium is a dangerous one to supplement. So we don't really supplement it unless, of course, if the doctor requires from a person to take supplement the calcium for osteopenia or any other bone disease, then of course we support it. But there are better ways to handle that. Once we understand that we can't build bone by calcium. We need to have bone built by protein. So 40% of the bone is actually protein. And there's plenty of calcium in meat. So if we eat a lot of meat, we don't really necessarily need to supplement any calcium. I don't see if that makes any sense for you, but it requires a lot more than just calcium to build calcium. And if people supplement calcium, it can become a problem in the blood because in the human blood, calcium is not really working as a water-soluble element. So whereas you can put calcium into water and mix it really good and it's going to dissolve, it's not going to do the same in the blood. It's not going to be able to deposit, for example, even with protein, if there's no fat around or there's no other elements like B12, et cetera. So you have to have a lot of other things. And vitamin D is very important, for example, for the deposition of calcium into the bone. But if you take too much D, it can remove excess as well. So we have problems. So it's best to just stick natural and eat a lot of meat, which is rich in calcium and it's rich in all the vitamin D, provided you eat grass-fed animals and you also eat the organs. Then you get all the nutrients, including calcium, that you need. We just said and done, migraineurs genetically have more calcium in their cells than what is necessary. So the last thing you want to supplement is calcium. In terms of magnesium, we need a lot of magnesium. Magnesium has a lot of roles in the body. And in terms of migraineurs, the most important role, of course, is to open the ionic gates, the ones that are not working properly. So the magnesium attaches to an ATP molecule, and then it pulls open the pump so the sodium can come in and the potassium can go out. And then when the magnesium falls off from the gate, and as the gate closes, that's when the sodium leaves and the potassium can come in. So magnesium has a strong function in the brain in the creation of the voltage. And because we use more voltage and we create it more often, so we need more magnesium for migraineurs. However, because it is operating these sodium potassium pumps, it then acts as an excitatory mineral. So a migraine taking magnesium at night, for example, has a very good chance of being up at night and having nightmares. So it is not like there are some magnesiums that are sold that are called calm, etc. They don't calm a migraine. They may calm other people, but not necessarily a migraine. Then a potassium. We don't supplement potassium because that is very dangerous. I have an article on Hormones Matter, which you may want to link to, that in which I interviewed a friend who's a cardio surgeon, emergency room cardio surgeon, who's retired but is still working part-time and probably now doing COVID excess time. And I asked him a lot of questions about potassium. How does that work when we supplement potassium? And he's very much against supplementing potassium. It can be extremely dangerous to do so because potassium, by its nature, is usually inside the cells. So it's not in our blood. So if somebody's taking a blood test, you can see that the millimole per liter equivalent in the sodium and potassium, they're quite different. The potassium is very tiny. It's like 3.5 to 4.5, but the sodium is like 135 to 145. So we have like 40 times as much sodium in our blood than potassium. And so we are not expecting to have a lot of potassium in our blood. And if we take it, it can cause heart arrhythmia. It can cause a lot of problems. And so it's not a very good idea to supplement potassium at all. So what we do is we recommend that everybody eat a high potassium diet. So when you're eating steak or burger or any kind of beef for that matter, they're very high in potassium. If you look at the USDA database, you can look at the potassium values of many, not all that they have there, but most of them, they'll list the potassium value if you don't choose brand names. And then you can see that, for example, salmon, if it is fresh, wild caught salmon, it will have 800 milligram potassium per 100 gram. And who is eating 100 grams? Usually 200 or something even more than that. I'm yet to eat anything less than a 12-ounce steak. So when you're looking, and that's like 300 grams, right? Almost. And so when you're looking at the amount, and in steak is like about 400 milligram potassium per 100 gram on average, could be more or less depending on the kind. If you eat a 12-ounce steak, you just had 1,200 milligrams of potassium. So you eat a lot of potassium. You don't really need to supplement it. And then if you eat salmon, it's even higher. If you eat wild game, it's even higher. There's no reason to supplement potassium at all.
Got it. That's super helpful. Thank you, Angela. And would love to hear are you writing another book right now on ketosis?
So I haven't yet decided. I started to write one.
Okay.
And then I realized that there may be a lot of overlap with what I want to say with an updated migraine book. So I may be coming down. And also I'm thinking about writing a book on ketosis that is explaining the state of ketogenesis better, because I find that it isn't really explained anywhere. Everybody jumps into ketosis, or they take a very lightweight approach. Well, this is ketosis. This is what you have to do. And then you're going to be in ketosis. So this kind of an approach then initiate things like a lot of sweeteners that people eat that are 0 calorie because they think, well, it's going to be okay. But it's not okay. It also initiates the fat bombs, the MCT oil doses amassed, stuff like that. So it's a lot of misinformation out there, which can, for some people, be harmful over the long time. So I'm thinking that I may have 2 separate books, one in which it's migraine, and I incorporate in that the carnivore diet and the ketogenic diet, or I may have a separate book for the diet forms, and then maybe have a third book that just focuses very specifically on what is ketogenesis, and particularly also want to get into the explanation of children who are always in ketosis. And you know, a lot of mothers I see discussing that, well, they have to have carbs because of, you know, they're pregnant and they nurse, and they can't nurse if they don't have enough carbs, etc. And actually that baby is in ketosis. It's in ketosis in the womb. It's in ketosis at birth and all through probably until age 16. In literature, By Cahill, it's just until age 10 for sure, because he had the experiments for that. But I have a lot of teenagers in my migraine group, and we test their blood glucose and blood ketones, and they're in ketosis all through. And so far, I have yet to test anyone who is not in ketosis. So we always make a base level of ketones. It's a natural for us. And so we need to understand that this is not an alien thing. It's not a fad. It's actually our baseline. And so I think I want to write a separate book about that.
Yeah, I think that would be fantastic. And I look forward to all of those. This has been excellent, Angela. Thank you so much for coming on today and chatting with me. I've learned so much, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners will learn a lot and want to learn more. So where can they find out more about you? And I'll have links to all of it in the show notes and at carnivorecast.com.
Sure. Thanks, Scott. They can definitely find me. Of course, I'm on Twitter. My hashtag, whatever it's called, I can't even think of it, is Migraine Book. And of course, I'm on Instagram under Dr. Angela Stanton. Then on Facebook, they can find me under Angela A. Stanton, PhD. And also the migraine book is the migraine group. I have two, but the main one is the migraine sufferers. So if they search migraine sufferers, they're going to be getting to my group. The long name is migraine sufferers who want to be cured by the Stanton migraine protocol. But it had to be, as a result of Facebook, they told us to put a trade name there. So there's a trademark name. And then the ketogenic group, which is an exclusive group. So you can only join that group if you're no longer on any medications. If any medications, be it migraine or not medication, you can't join that. Unless, of course, thyroid medication is fine, but other medications are not fine. And that would be the Stanton ketogenic diet for migraineurs. And let's see, where else can they reach me? And of course, they can contact me through my page, which is stantonmigraineprotocol.com. There's a contact page if they want to contact me from there.
Excellent. I'll have links to all of that. And thank you again so much for joining today, Angela. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Scott. It's been really a lot of fun. Thank you for inviting me.
If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on Carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered, or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at CarnivoreCast, or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.